stage uh, that admits people who believe they've been reincarnated. And it took me a long time to actually come up with the Ouroboros Society. I think it had about 6 different names before then. But the origin of it was I used to have a job where I had to meet with a lot of people who ran businesses. I would often sit across the table from them and think, how did this person get their job? And I always wondered, like, why didn't somebody tap me on the shoulder when I was 16 and say, you're going to be CEO of, whatever. And so I thought, what if there's a sinister secret society where everybody's doing favors for everybody else and you weren't invited to join? Because see, that's the only way I can actually explain my life. So that's how the Ouroboros Society came about. But like I said, I went through about 6 different names, which I can't even remember at this point. But my editor is here somewhere. He probably can.
Well, in my other life, I am a historian. I teach college history at Macalester in St. Paul, and I specifically specialize in the history of gender violence and sexuality in the early modern period, which is 1500 to 1800. And for those of you who know your history, that's the time when witchcraft went insane in terms of persecution, things like the Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, all sorts of religious upheaval. And my books start from characters, like a central character who is in trouble. And Calla was the spark that started Nightshade. And I knew she was a warrior, and I knew she was a wolf. But I also knew she was in trouble. So in building the world for Nightshade, I needed to figure out what could be even more powerful than she was. And I ended up drawing on my history background and thinking about all the chaos around religious belief and the warfare that went on in the 17th century, and thought, well, what if all of that wasn't just the history that we know? What if there was actually a secret war between 2 factions of powerful witches that started in the 1400s and is still going on today and occasionally spills out into our world so that it affects us? And that was where the world of Nightshade came about. So keepers and searchers were the names behind the 2 factions of witches that just have to do with who they are and their intent. But the witch world itself is tied into the history that I do.
Dystopian is kind of interesting to write because one of the tropes is that if the society or government is in control, then they make everything sound as clinical and boring and bland as possible. And so when I was writing Matched, and it was called the matching system, it still is, my sister and I would brainstorm, what else could it possibly be besides the matching, the coupling, we have all these very bizarre terms. And so a lot of it was about using these really general terms, but then finding a really creative system or history to go into making them still interesting, even though it's kind of like this very sterile, bland description, if that makes sense.
The replacement, a lot of the creatures are actually taken straight from folklore, so it was more of, for me, it was more of an issue of kind of looking at where the folklore was and then extrapolating what I thought that would transform into if it had been left to kind of atrophy by itself for a couple hundred years. And so the names are all straight out of books, but I did change the way that the creatures appear.
Well, I'm fascinated by linguistics, and so I figured if you were in a contained area, that the first thing to change would be people's names and their slang or their curse words. So I picked out some slang and curse words and tried to twist them and tried to show that there was a natural evolution, like really comes from brilliant and putz comes from chutzpah and things like that. Brexing actually came about because my original word was brack. And at that point in time, I had not seen Battlestar Galactica, and for which my husband almost didn't marry me. But then my editor said, hey, guess what? Battlestar Galactica is kind of big. You should know this. And so I had to change brack, and I needed to come up with a word, and I was just cruising around blogs because that's what I do when I should be working. And I saw somebody use the word frex, and at the time I thought, hey, that's a cool word. I'm going to steal it. And then I realized that it meant, for example, and I just didn't know anything. But I actually built it into the book, and if you read carefully, the financial resource exchange is the thing that sends the ship off into space. And I figured that would be a natural progression of the other F word.